I don't know what the reason for it is, but the church does not include the last line of the story that we just heard, but it's important, and so I'm going to give it to you. Now, you did hear this. Jesus said to them, "Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." But here's the line that you missed. When they heard this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. And the point is that the Pharisees, those who were most hostile to Jesus, were amazed at him. Well, for the last several weeks, we've been hearing Jesus telling the Pharisees parables. And these parables were not well received among the Pharisees, who were already critical and outright hostile to Jesus. But Jesus was warning them that they would face God's judgment someday. And while he was speaking in parables to them, they weren't stupid. And they recognized that Jesus was accusing them of some pretty bad things. Well, anyway, today's gospel contains an interesting nugget of information. Matthew tells us that the head Pharisees sent their disciples along with some Herodians to catch Jesus in a trap. And so today we see two groups getting together to provoke Jesus into saying something, anything, that they might use against him. But the Pharisees and the Herodians were not usually friendly with each other. The Pharisees were all about Jewish purity, and they objected profoundly to Roman rule, while the Herodians were not even really Jewish, and they worked closely with the Romans. And so the two groups were not friendly with each other. And it's interesting that the Pharisees felt that they needed the help of a rival group in order to catch Jesus in the trap that they were laying for him. Jesus must have been so skilled and so wise in their eyes that they felt that they needed help in the first place. And the Pharisees and the Herodians getting together was kind of a sort of an application of the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they set out to trap Jesus into saying something that they would later be able to use against him. And the trap that they came up with was actually very simple. It's just a question that encourages one simple yes or no answer. If Jesus answered yes to the question, he'd be in trouble. And if he answered no, he'd still be in trouble. And the question was this: is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, the Jews were generally opposed to Roman rule in Jerusalem and Israel. And the Romans to them were basically pagan overlords who had no right to be there. And if Jesus answered yes, he'd be in trouble with his fellow Jews for being a supporter of the Romans. But if he answered no, Jesus could be accused of rebellion against the Roman Empire and therefore be in trouble with the Roman authorities. And the Pharisees thought they'd gotten Jesus backed into a corner and that he'd condemn himself no matter what answer he gave them. But, as is always the case in the Gospels, it's never a good idea to try to trap Jesus. And that's because Jesus will use the trap to your disadvantage and make it a trap for you. And so Jesus asks to see the coin that was used to pay the tax. Well, they gave him the coin, and the coin was a small thing that carried the face of the emperor, and it was engraved with the characters that identified the emperor as the emperor, but it also identified him as the Son of God. So they gave him a coin with Caesar's image, claiming to be the Son of God. You can actually see that coin online and in museums. They minted a lot of them. Taxes were high in those days. Jesus takes the coin and asks, whose image and inscription is this? And they answered, it's Caesar's. And he tells them, then repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. It's a brilliant response. Jesus is telling the Pharisees that it's okay to pay their tax to Caesar, that they need to give the state what they owe the state, and therefore be contributing members of the society. But Jesus is also getting at something even deeper than that, way deeper. Now, in the Old Testament, in the very first chapter of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, God creates man and woman, and God says this, Let us make human beings in our image after our likeness. And God created humanity in his image. So each one of us is made in the image and likeness of God. And so Jesus is providing a double meaning in his response. Yes, you can give your money to Caesar, but you need to give your life, yourself, to God. And Matthew tells us that when they heard this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. In other words, they were struck by the truth of what Jesus had said, and they were surprised at the fact that they couldn't trap him because his answer was not only smart, it was brilliant. And so today, Jesus is teaching us that for us, there are two levels of authority, two kinds of obedience that we have to follow. There are the human laws, and then there is God's law. And the coin that carries Caesar's likeness and inscription should be given to Caesar because it belonged to him. And the one stamped with God's image and likeness should be given to God. Now, like that coin of Caesar, we carry, in a sense, the divine face of Jesus Christ himself. We bear his image and likeness. And Jesus is telling us that as we live and move and act in our lives, when people see us, they should see Jesus Christ. When others see us, they should see in us the face of Christ. And while we sometimes have a tendency to think that we aren't worth very much, that we're like a beat-up, old, and very dull penny, well, that beat-up, old, and very dull penny still carries the image of the God who created us. We still belong to the God who created the universe, even when it feels like we've given all our money to Caesar, and I know it sometimes feels like that, but our lives still belong to God, the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. And so our first loyalty above all else should be to the God who created us in the first place, that we might live in the world carrying his image and likeness to all that we encounter here in this life. Because we are called to be the light of the world and to transform the places in which we live and work in order to make them more human, because humanity is made in the image of God.